Hi, my name is Samantha Eichenberg. I'm here with Alex Collis and Justin Dunn to interview Alex Raden, who is a Holocaust survivor, and we are in Baltimore, Maryland on September 21st, 2010. Okay. Thank you for interviewing me.
My pleasure.
What year were you born?
1934.
1934. In what country?
Poland.
Poland. What part?
Actually, I was born in Warsaw, the capital of Poland.
What do you remember Warsaw being like?
Okay. The war started in 1939, so I was only 5 years old. And my memory of those years is somewhat limited since I was born 5 years before the war started. We had a family of my parents and my sister, who was born in 1938, right before the war. So for the first 4 years, I was the only child, and we had a comfortable life. My father was a businessman. He owned a store that sold furniture, and he also manufactured some of the furniture, and the store was very close to where we lived. I would consider, in American comparison, it would be like a middle-class family. We were religious, of course. My father was not Hasidic. He didn't have a beard, but he attended synagogue on the holidays and on Shabbat. And my mother was employed as a teacher in a Jewish school that I know for a fact, and I was treated very well. I have pictures, a few pictures. Most of the things that we had from those days disappeared in smoke, basically. They just vanished, all the memorabilia from before the war, except for a few things that my mother had saved. So I see in the pictures that I always was dressed nice, and I was in a baby carriage and being wheeled around Warsaw, going to the park and so on. Yes.
What were your parents' names?
My mother was, well, everyone called her Gito, but her real name was Gertrude. And my father, they called him Izzy, but his name was Yitzchak. So I guess in America it would be Isaac. And our name was, in Polish, it was Radzinsky. But when it came to America, they shortened it. So instead of Radzinsky, it was Raden. They cut off the last part. They were Gertrude and Yitzchak Radzinsky.
Do you remember how old they were when they got married and had children?
My parents were, I don't even know when they were married, but I know that my mother was born in 38. Excuse me, not 38, but my mother was in 1908. 1908. And my father was born in 1904. So when the war started, of course, they were in their 40s, I imagine, you know. They were married for about 4 years before I was born. And then, of course, 8 years after my sister was born, 4 years after my sister was born, we were 4 years apart.
Were you close with all of your family members?
We had a large family. My parents were close to them. I was just a little kid, but we were a closely knit family. Some of them had left Poland before the war. Some went to, before the war, went to Argentina. They made their life there, and I don't know them, I've never met them, but they were my mother's two brothers.
What were their names?
Their name was Abe Radzinsky and Jacob Radzinsky. Actually, my mother and my father were first cousins. So their names are kind of confusing, but they were, you know, I guess among Jewish people, even today, first cousins sometimes marry. not anymore in the United States, but in Europe and other places. So these two went to Argentina, and then my father's sister and brother left Poland also before the war, and they came to America, and that's where they spent the war. After the war, when I left Poland, I came here. I came to them, basically. They were my only relatives. But there were many others. Both of us, my mother and father, had big families, and none of them survived. So after the war, we were just like the only ones, basically.
What was your father like?
You know, I don't really know. He was the only thing I know about my father was I remember him a little, but I do know that after the war, we had gotten letters from various Polish people who worked for my father and who knew him and wrote letters about him in Polish, which I've forgotten by now, but we had these letters and they were praising him. He was a very resourceful person. He was very, you know, he could foretell the future, but I guess no matter how smart you are, he couldn't really see what was coming. Or he would have taken us and left Poland at that time. And he was well established in Warsaw, had a business, sold furniture, and he never imagined that something would come in 3 or 4 years like that and just like wipe everybody out. So, but he saved our lives basically, so that he was a very good person, I guess. You know, he died and he was only 34 years old, I think, 40, close.
How did you save your life?
Well, we you know, this would already go into the war. I mean, before the war, we would just find a nice family living in Warsaw, a modern city. You know, Warsaw was pretty modern. I mean, we were, you know, basically well taken care of, and you know, had every amenity and everything. But when the war came, had taken Czechoslovakia in a few weeks, and they right away attacked Poland and took Poland in a week or two. And so when they came to Warsaw, we were living in a fancy, nice fancy apartment on Targowa Street. And the Germans, within a few months of occupation, they declared that all Jews must relocate to, well, they didn't call it a ghetto, they just said, they designated on a map where you allowed to live. But basically it turned into be a ghetto, kind of a closed area. So we were there, and of course there was a lot of things went on, and because my father was resourceful, we had managed to escape from there, and eventually made our way to the what they call the Aryan side, or where the Polish people were allowed to live, and from there we were able to hide, etc. You know, going on and on. So
I guess next interview we can get into
yes,
details
so
about
right,
that.
exactly. So that's why I'm just giving a brief look into the future.
Thank you. What do you remember about your mother?
My mother was, well, she actually was a teacher, and surprisingly, I didn't know this, but I found out later on that she actually spoke a little English, which was rare in those days, not like in Europe today, where a lot of people speak English, but in those days, in Poland, they spoke Yiddish, they spoke Hebrew, but English was a rare thing, but she spoke a little English because she had corresponded with family in America. She wrote English letters, and some of the family showed me the letters that they kept. It was my mother's handwriting, and it was written in English. And she was a modern Jewish lady. She cooked Jewish food, you know, and from what I remember, she prepared for Shabbos and made challahs. In those days, you had to make your own food pretty much, because the supermarkets, there wasn't any such thing that Jewish, you know, kosher food. So everything you had was either you made it or you bought it raw and just cooked it or something. So my mother was kind of nice about this. She provided us with everything, from what I remember. I remember more about my mother in America. Of course, my mother survived the war, and came to the U.S. when we were married. My wife and I got married, so we were able to bring my mother from Poland under our auspices. Like, we had to make out like an affidavit or something of support. So when my mother came, thank God that we lived together for a number of years. She came in 1960 and she died in 85. So 25 years she lived a very nice life in Brooklyn, New York, you know, and as much as we could, we saw her, we visited her. We were always away from the city. We always lived away, but she came to all the simchas, all the, I mean, like happy occasions and bris, whatever she was able, so.
Do you remember, was she a good cook?
She was a very good cook. I just know of her cooking here in the United States. Like, my mother was typical Jewish mother. I guess she always wanted to feed us, so whenever we would come and visit in her little apartment in Bensonhurst, that's a little part of Brooklyn, she would right away says, sit down and eat something, you know. It's like, we might have just gone to a restaurant before that, but regardless, knowing how much pleasure she took in feeding us, we ate from it. She actually was alone, because, you know, my father was killed, so she didn't have an income as much as she could. She worked a little bit in America. She was getting older, and she got a job in a nursing home to help the older people who were older than her, basically, and her income was somewhat limited. But whenever we came there, she always had a beautiful table set up with food and drink and so on, and always asked us. The children came, and she would, my older daughter, of course, is married now with 6 children, but at that time she wasn't married, and my mother would like always say, well, Rachel, when are you getting married or something, you know, typical. And my daughter would say, don't worry, Mama, you know, soon or something. That's the way she was always.
Do you remember what Friday nights were like in Shabbos at your home?
At our home, I don't recall a whole lot, because I said I was only 4 years old and I really didn't know. Of course, me and my wife, we were always brought up, you know, after I left Poland, I was immersed in Jewish traditions because I was in yeshiva in London, yeshiva in the United States, and our home was always A1, you know, how do you say, everything was just the way it should be in the code of Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, and all my children are brought up that way too. My own parents, it's hard to say because I don't remember, but I know they were both religious and both kept Shabbos and all the commandments, but visually I can't see them, you know, doing anything.
Do you have any visual memories from that time?
Very little. I remember a few things from, I'm talking about 1935, let's say, or 30. I was born in 34, I just don't remember what happened in 35, 36, but about 38, I remember that we had an apartment on the first floor in a very beautiful area, and across there was a park, and I sort of recall that we had a terrace, or open like a porch, and my father had put into the awning on the porch a swing, just a little swing like, and so I could swing out into the porch and back into the apartment, back and forth. And I remember that. And the fact is that in 1939, September 1st, when the Germans marched into Warsaw, our street was the one where they made like a big victory parade or something. And I was just swinging on the porch, and out there was this column of like 6 abreast with flags marching. And people would look out the windows, and I guess some Polish people were waving, maybe the Jewish too, I don't know. No one really knew what would happen. It's not like the Germans had a history of killing Jews yet. We didn't know. There was no radio, there was a radios, but you know, there wasn't like minute by minute news, so we didn't know. There was no TV, there was no film records of what they did in Czechoslovakia and what they did in Slovenia, wherever they captured first. So word hadn't filtered yet to the Jews of Warsaw, so everybody was like standing there and watching them coming. But it didn't take very long when they established their rule and their, what they were going to do, especially to the Jewish people in the population. So.
Did you have any good friends?
They might have been like 4 years old, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I was one of the younger survivors. Most survivors today are in their 80s, maybe, more or less. And since I'm only like 76, 77, I was very little then. So my recollection of friends in Poland would be very minimal.
Yeah.
Really.
Did you have a nanny? Or?
We did have a nanny. How do I know that? Because some pictures that I had found after my mother passed away, we went to her apartment and looked through all her shoe boxes and stuff, and we found pictures of me in a carriage, and the person pushing me wasn't my mother, and I don't think it was a relative, it was probably a nanny. And a lot of people, middle class, had nannies in Poland.
Do you remember her name?
No, called a nana, but right, I don't remember.
Did you have, were your grandparents around?
No, actually my grandparents on both sides had passed away before I was born. So I didn't have, I know their names, but the only reason I know that is because when I say like a Yiskar, which is like a prayer for someone who passed away on Yom Kippur, you have to say the name of the person and the name of their father and mother or something like that. But I can't visualize. I do have pictures, old like daguerreotypes, like brownish looking pictures, and my grandfather is on one of them, and my grandmother I guess is on another, but that's all I know of them is what I saw in their pictures. I've never met them in person.
Were you in school before the war?
If I was, it would have probably been like nursery school, something like where 5-year-olds go, I guess, play groups or something.
Do you remember what you did for fun?
I don't think so. What does a 5-year-old do for fun? It's hard to say. When the war started, I'm sort of limiting it to before 1939, and we played. I mix up some of the memories with wartime, when I was a little older. We would play with kids, we would go outside and play. We had the little games and things. I think the thing I remember the most was we had like I don't know, I never saw it here. Most of the things we did were made by us to play with. You didn't go to a store and buy stuff. There wasn't toy shops that much. There may have been some, but I don't remember ever getting a toy, so we made our own. We had like a wooden wheel, a stick, and we would like push it down the road, make sure it goes straight. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it's sort of like a wheel.
Yeah. What else did you
Like
have?
a hula hoop, but they didn't use it for that. They used it for wheeling you down the road. And then we also had, like, we would go in the winter, and Poland has pretty good winters, So we obviously had sleds. And I remember that where we lived in Warsaw, there was a park across from us. I think now they're changed because my grandchildren went to Poland and went to the same area and told me that there was housing developments on either side of that street and there was no more park. But at that time there was a park and there was slopes, and we would sled down the hill on the slopes in the wintertime. As it was snowing, Poland has a winter that lasts a little bit longer than here. Like once it snowed, it wouldn't go away for like 3 months. It would just stay on the ground mostly, because it was always cold. Yeah.
Did your mother ever tell you anything about how you were as a child?
It's a funny thing. My mother, after the war, when she came here, I left Poland when I was only 12 and a half years old. So when I left, my mother didn't go. I just was alone, so she sent me away to Europe, to England. But when she came to America in 1960, I think it was, I asked her questions about a lot of things, like how was the war, you know, and about the Holocaust and things like that, that she remembered everything, but she just didn't want to talk about it a lot. So every time I asked, she says, like in Yiddish, was darfst du wissen, you know, like, why do you need to know about this? And so the only thing I knew was how my father was killed and how we survived. So, because I was already getting older, like when the war started I was 5, but then during the war I was 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, you know. So in those years I remember things. But anything that happened before 1939 was basically like a memory, some of it told by my mother, some of it she, you know, my sister was born right a year before the war, and while I was alone, I was pampered a lot. She, you know, I know that too because I had an aunt, my father's sister, who lived here in America, and she was older and she remembered when I was a little kid. So she would say, oh, nobody was allowed to touch. My name was Olek because Alex is like, you know, that was like in Polish, I guess you call it Olek.
How do you spell that?
O-L-E-K. It's a diminutive for Alex, I guess. So they called me Oleg, but she says my mother always didn't want anyone to mess with me, you know, sort of to protect me or something. Whatever happened, I don't know, but that's just I remember.
What was your sister like?
My sister, she was, you know, born when I was 4 years old, and I was a little jealous, I guess, like all kids, you know, and my sister all of a sudden, attention away from you to her, and she cried a lot. I sort of figured, what's this little thing crying all? But she eventually turned out okay. But for a while there, the war started, she was only a baby, and you know, it was hard. She ended up in a convent. They gave her to an orphanage, and there was a lot of problems surviving for her. But she survived, thank God, and you know, she's fine now. She was married, her husband passed away, but she happens to be a psychiatrist. She graduated medical school in Poland. We brought her to America also. We brought her to America because we were married and we were able to do a lot of things, like make out an affidavit and pay for the passage and so on. So that's how we ended up bringing my mother and sister to America.
Do you guys have any questions?
I suppose if I was older,
yeah,
before the war, I would have had many more memories, you know, of what happened. But being only like 4 years old.
Have you been back to the time you were born in?
Well, I wanted to go back, but you know, Poland was that type of country where most Jewish people who were left alive after the war, and there weren't many, left Poland without going back. They simply didn't want to face memories of the bad times that they had, so we never went back. We did go back to Hungary, where Eva's parents and so on come from. But Poland, my sister, of course, lived there till about 1964, and she went back several times. Because, you know, she was actually finished medical school there, so she had friends, grown-ups. I was never tempted to go back, to be honest with you. There was nothing there for me. None of my family survived. And we left, then my sister was brought here, my mother was brought here, and there's nobody else in Poland that I would even want to go see. So there's a lot to it. I mean, there are a lot of things that I know that happened after the war, but we never went back.
When were you first affected by the war? How old were you?
Well, Germans came to Poland in 1939, September. I was 5 years old, and for about 3-4 months, we were just under German occupation. And so we really didn't know what's happening.
Did anything seem different?
Yes, right. Within a few, maybe a month or two, there were a lot of things that went on. For example, the Germans were very strict about everything. Like the first thing they did was they took people off the street. Like they would take, let's say, 50 men and arrest them just off the street, and then they put them in a jail somewhere in Warsaw. They made like a big jail, and they put big posters. This was the way of communicating with the population, by putting out posters, because nobody had a radio hardly, and there wasn't anything like that. But posters people read, so you could see them all over the street, posters. And it said, in German and Polish, and it would say like, attention, the following are people, and they listed all the names of those 50 people that they had. And they said, these people have now been arrested and have been kept as hostages. If anything occurs that is against the rules of the occupying forces, or whatever they call them, during the German occupation, like for example, if somebody would, let's say, hit a German or maybe even kill a German, they would execute all 50 people. So it was like a way of preventing anything happening, because some of the people, maybe they knew some of the people that were on that list. And regardless, I mean, why would you want to do anything and they would end up killing 50 people, So that was a way of them to maintain kind of a peace and quiet. What really happened was, within about, well, maybe 9 months into the occupation, we right away realized that the Germans, they really had it in for the Jews particularly. And so, again, they put out posters so we would know, and they said all Jews of Jewish origin, Jewish mother or father, or blah blah, this and that, you could have been converted, but it didn't matter. If you had like a Jewish origin, you were a Jew. So they designated an area of Warsaw, in the older section of Warsaw. We lived in like a newer section called Praga, which is like on one side of the river. There was a river running in Warsaw called the Wisła, or Vistula River. And on one side was Praga, and the other side of Warsaw. So the whole thing was called Warsaw. It's like Minneapolis, St. Paul, you know what I mean? There's like a in between. So anyway, we were in a nice area, but the ghetto was designated in a certain area, and they blocked it off, showing where it would be. And it says you have a month, I don't remember anymore how much time, but very little, to move there. Any Jew that is found outside these designated things will be shot. It was plain and simple.
What did you make of all that when you were younger?
Well, I sort of relied on my parents to guide us what to do. The real frightening business came when we moved into the ghetto, which is, we had to move. But that was terrible, because even at a young age, I was like 7 years old, I knew that I could die. I mean, I can't imagine how a child of 7 knows about death, but yet we just took it for granted, because when we moved to the ghetto, they built a wall, and they were building the wall while we were there, and that wall was maybe, I would say, maybe 8 feet high, and to make sure that nobody climbs over, what they did was put barbed wire on top. And some parts, they ran out of wire, and they took cement, and before the cement set, they would stick like broken bottles and jagged glass in there. So when the cement set, the glass and stuff would stick out, and if you try to climb over, get all cut up or whatever. And besides, they patrolled with guns and dogs. So once we were in there, we couldn't get out. And the Germans, that part of the ghetto didn't have any manufacturing, they didn't have any dairy farms or anything. It was like in the middle of a city. So the Jews, whatever they had brought with them, they had, but the stores ran out of food within a week or two. You couldn't buy anything. And so there was very little food. If something broke, like the sewer line, you couldn't fix it because what could you do? So a lot of people were starving, and many people died of starvation and maybe disease. And I could actually walk the street and see dead people lying in the corner there covered with a newspaper, because there was no ambulance to take them away or something. I mean, so once a week a Jewish burial society would go around with a wagon and pick up the people and put them in the wagon and take them to a cemetery that was right outside the ghetto walls.
How did you manage to deal with all of that and witnessing those things for the first
Well,
time?
I guess you can get used to anything, but you know, it's hard really to imagine what went through my mind. There were a lot of terrible things that happened. We walked, my father and I were walking. Some of the parts of the ghetto, the wall was built in the middle of a street. Like one side of the street was the ghetto, and the other side was the Aryan, or whatever they call it, like the Gentiles people, the Polish people. And the wall was in the middle. And my father and I were walking in the ghetto side. We were just walking along, and the wall was to our left. And all of a sudden, German was on top floor of that building on the other side and started shooting at us from his window, you know, over the wall where we were. So my father grabbed me and pulled me against the wall, so we were out of the line of sight of the German guy. So I was like, all of a sudden, you know, he was so afraid, and I realized my father's afraid, so there's something to be afraid of, you know, and I just like, it shook me up really bad. We brought with us whatever we could, you know. You had to move out of your apartment, leave everything behind, so, and we couldn't go back. So my father had money, some Polish zlotys, and we had some gold pieces that in those days you didn't trust. There was no banks that much. You couldn't go like here, go write a check. There was, who knows. So it was, most people, when they had money, they exchanged it for gold, or like gold pieces, or maybe Krugerrands, or some money that was Swiss francs or whatever, and diamonds and jewelry and things like that. That they figured no matter what, we can always use that to buy things. So we took that into the ghetto, and we were able to buy things as much as we could. There was a lot of smuggled in food by teenagers who were able to sneak across the wall. What they did was at night they would like take out maybe 4 or 5 bricks, somehow dig out the bricks, and then they could go through and put the bricks back and go on the other side, I guess buy some bread or something and bring it over through the wall. And I was a little kid, but some of my friends were older, and they encouraged me to come with them and all. So the only time I remember doing something was there was a train track right along the wall, and the train would sometimes slow down, and there were some wagons filled with potatoes that were being taken to the front or wherever the Germans needed them. And we ran after the train, and one kid jumped on top and was throwing down potatoes from the train wagon, and we picked them up and put them in sacks, and this is what we snuck across with. And I remember one time, you know, we were running with sacks of potatoes trying to get to the wall, and some Polish teenagers, maybe older than us or maybe the same age, they ran after us, and like they had a razor blade or a knife, and they would like slash the sack and the potatoes would start falling out. So by the time we got to the wall, there was like no potatoes left. So, you know, it was sad, but that's what they did, that I remember. And it really was pretty bad. The ghetto was a bad place to be. There was a lot of people that died. There was a lot of people that were very hungry, and there were some that were like, they went crazy from hunger, and they were like running, and if they saw you carrying, like, let's say you were eating a piece of bread, they would like grab it out of your hand and run with it. And everybody said, oh, catch that. By the time they caught him, he had already eaten it, so he didn't care, you know, what they could do to him. So the hunger was extremely high. There was disease. Jewish people tried to organize things. They organized little meetings, prayer sessions, and, you know, sort of help each other type of things. But it didn't take long. The German plan wasn't to keep us forever in the ghetto, as you can imagine. So within, well, first of all, we had to give our apartment away and move to the ghetto. So what happened was, everybody, all the Jews went over there trying to get a place to live within the allotted time. And if you were in there first, there wasn't that many apartments. And we found like a walk-up on the second or third floor, no elevator, of course. And the man who had it, a non-Jewish guy, he told us we could trade. He would give us his apartment, and he would take our apartment, which was like 10 times as big, you know, fancy in the area of Warsaw. But so we ended up with this walk-up, and that's where we were. And this was not a very comfortable or good place, but what could we do? It was like 3 rooms, and we were very close to a German prison that they had opened. They refurbished a tall building, and it was a famous prison that even now in history, you know it. My granddaughter went over there to look at it. It was on the street called Pavia, and the Germans called it the Pavia prison. Oh, it was an ominous place.
Do you remember the name of the ghetto you were in?
Warsaw Ghetto. Yeah, Warsaw. There were 2 ghettos in Warsaw. One was called Duże Ghetto and Małe Ghetto, meaning the larger ghetto and the smaller ghetto. And they were both, somehow they organized it. We were in the larger ghetto, and there was a passageway, like a closed-in, it's almost like, you could see people, if there are 2 buildings, they want people to go from one to the other. They built like you walked up the steps, and then you had to go through like a long corridor that below them there were non-Jewish people. You know, that was, but the Jews were on this side, and on that side you had to go through like a thing across. So we were in that part of the ghetto called Duże Ghetto, meaning the bigger ghetto.
What do you remember about the apartment that you lived in before? What was it like?
It was small. It was pretty shabby looking, and you had to, the building was in the form of a horseshoe, but not like this here. It was a big building, but it has like a courtyard, and the windows of everybody looked out into the courtyard. And I remember I was sitting by the window looking down. Beggars would come, and they holding up their hands, you know, people should throw down something.
This is in the ghetto?
In the ghetto, yeah. And sometimes Germans would come and see what's going on. As the months progressed, we realized that the ghetto wasn't the end for the Jews. That the German plan was to gather all the Jews from Warsaw. They did it in other cities too, like Lodz and Bytom and other places. But in Warsaw, they were going to evacuate all of us and take us to concentration camps like Majdanek, Treblinka, Auschwitz, you know, all the different camps. They never told us, so I guess people didn't know what the evacuation was for, but in the beginning they said, well, we're going to relocate you to a better place, you know, like they described it in flowing language, like maybe they thought maybe we would go for it. They said there are trees there and stuff, not like here. There's more food. Just to get them to go without, you know. So, but eventually people realized that there's just no way that they're going to do that, and all they're doing is taking us someplace. So, so the Germans had to do it by force. What they used to do is like, they would come down with these trucks, and they would like close off a street. One truck would go the north part of the street, another one would go on the south side, playing their sirens. It wasn't like the Americans, like a different kind of siren. Every time I used to hear that, I was like, you know, tremble, because the siren, like a klaxon, you know, like that. And they would close up the street. The Germans would run off the truck with soldiers, you know, with uniforms and helmets and guns and dogs, and they would grab people, rouse, everybody, go, you know, and push them in the trucks and drive them away. So we knew there was not a good thing. So when we heard these noises from the trucks coming, the one incident I remember, I'll never forget that. My mother, father, me, and my sister, the little baby, we ran downstairs into the courtyard, and there was like a sewer, you know, like a big sewer cover. They opened it up, and everybody climbed down into the sewer. All right, so there was like a big room there with water on the ground flowing, I guess, sewer water. And but there was enough, so let's say 40 people got down there. And then one person, I guess a young guy, wasn't so afraid, so he covered it up. We were all there, everyone was quiet. My mother was holding my sister. And the Germans came to the courtyard, and they made everybody come downstairs from their apartments. There weren't so many people, that we were all down in the sewer. And they were walking on top of it. They were just like walking around. And my sister started crying. And everybody said, Mrs. Rudinsky, close her mouth, you know, like they were really mad. And my mother got so afraid that they would strangle her. So I think one woman had a pacifier, or some kind of thing, put it in her mouth. And that saved her from being strangled or something, because if the crying would get to them, they would realize what's going on. Anyway, they went away, and we climbed out of the sewer after the German trucks left. And then my father decided that we would have to leave the ghetto if we could, because the end will be we will be removed. The other incident I remember in the ghetto was the Germans had different ways of controlling the population. They said, if you come to this office and you get a work permit, you can work for the German government or the German factory or something, and then you won't have to leave. So my father naturally got a card that him and my mother would work in this factory. It wasn't really, it was like a big building with maybe 6 floors, and one of the floors had they were making wooden shoes, platform shoes. Basically it was like a shoe, a plain piece of wood that's shaped in the bottom of a foot with like a strap on it. So, and they were making them for the camps, because that's what they gave to the people in the camps. But this place made the shoes, and they had to pack them in boxes, take them downstairs, and trucks would like drive them away. So every morning, my father and my mother took my sister and me, and we went to the factory. So I was just playing with a bunch of kids on the floor. There were like old mattresses. We were playing in the mattresses, and my sister was lying in that little, like a trundle of some kind that they had, like a little bed. And but then one day the Germans came and closed down the bottom, and they went upstairs and they said, everybody rouse, rouse, rouse. They were hitting people with their truncheons, that all the people come downstairs. And they took us downstairs, and they made us line up on the street, and we were marching to it was a big railroad station in Warsaw, from which there were trains that were going to go to different places, like, I guess, Treblinka, Majdanek, Święcim, you know, different, I don't know where, but they were taking. So we were marching down that big road, and the Germans had lined up guards on either side of this big group of people, women, children, men, everybody was like marching, walking, and the Germans were along the side, and if you got out of the line, one German would run out and start hitting you until you dropped dead or whatever. They just like broke your bone. And they had dogs, and we were so afraid of them because the dogs were like German shepherds or something, and they were really vicious. And and they had machine guns. I mean, you could get killed. So we walked, and my father, then we were walking, and there was the streets, the houses were empty. They were already evacuated a lot of people, and we were just knowing, my father knew we were going to some terrible place. So he was trying a way to run away, but we couldn't. But then we passed by trolley cars, old trolley cars that were empty, abandoned, because Warsaw had trolleys. You know, they ran on tracks, and some of them were electric. I mean, they had like lines, like in the old days, I guess like San Francisco now, but in those days, trolleys were the only way to get around Warsaw. So these trolleys were abandoned, and we were walking by the trolley, and we were right next to it. And my father grabbed my hand, and he was like very upset. He says, "Oleg, next trolley that we come to, you just crawl in there and lie down on the ground and wait till the column of people pass by, and then when everybody leaves, come out of the trolley and go back to my mother's brother, who was supposedly still was alive in an apartment nearby." He says, "And wait, we'll come back and get you." And I was like maybe 7, 8 years old, and I said, no, I'm not going. I'm not leaving. You know, a little kid, I knew that if I left, I'll probably never see them again, and then what? I'm just going to be alone. But my father was so mad at me and so angry that like he hit me. He says, "I'm telling you, you must do this. And don't worry, we'll come and get you." But by the time he had been so strict about it, we had already passed the last trolley, and we approached this place, this railroad yard, with hundreds of people already waiting around, with Germans screaming and yelling and hitting people. And we were waiting for the next train, I guess, to take us away someplace. And my father saw a Jewish policeman. You see, the Germans, they deputized, I guess that's what you would call it, some Jews, mostly the younger Jews, like in their 20s. They gave them like an armband. By the way, we all wore armbands, but that was not a bad, we just wore bands because they told us. But they had this armband that said Yiddish Polizei, meaning Jewish police. And they gave him like a truncheon, and they were supposed to control the crowds for the Germans. So the Germans wouldn't have to do all the work. And he saw a policeman that he knew from a friend, and he called him over. He says, "Look at me, you know me." So the guy was a little bit afraid to talk to us, but I think my father convinced him. He says, "You see, my daughter, Zosha, my sister's name is Zosha, Friederika. But anyway, he says, Zosha is sick. Look, she's hot, she's crying, she needs water. Can we go to that house?" There were houses all around that were empty. He says, "Just to get some water." So the Jewish policeman was afraid, but he went over to the German and said something to him, and the German like went like this. So my father grabbed my mother. She took Frida, Zosha, and me by the hand, and we slowly went to that house. And then I guess maybe they forgot about us or something, because as soon as we got in there, my father said, let's go quick. And we went up the stairs. It was like a 4-story house, typical Warsaw house. That staircase led 1 story, 2, 3, 4. By the time we got to the 4th floor, he opened up a little like a trap door. and the ladder came down, and we went on the roof, and well, we were on the roof. So from the roof, if you were in the middle of the roof, they couldn't see you from downstairs. If you went to the edge, they could. But we bent over real low. My father says, keep your head down. And the houses in that part of town were next to each other. You know, row houses, I guess you would call them here. And we went from one house to another until we saw that we were far enough away from this group of people and the Germans. We went downstairs and we went back to our own apartment, which by then was like not too many people around. And well, this was it. I mean,
You went back to the ghetto?
we were in the ghetto. This railroad station was actually, I think, was on the edge of the ghetto, you know, so we just went back to our own house. And well, by then, I guess my parents realized that if there was no way out, on the next transport, we would be gone, you know, they would take us. So there was not many people left in the ghetto. And there were a lot of Polish tradesmen and just regular Polish people who lived near the ghetto on the other side, and they got permission to come into the ghetto. I guess their excuse was that they were trading with the Jews, or buying, with selling, whatever. Basically, they were just going into an empty house and taking stuff, you know, and taking it back to their houses on the other side. So the Germans let them do that. And they gave them some kind of paper and listed all the names. Let's say there was a group of like 6 Polish people who came to trade. And my father saw a group like this walking by, and he went downstairs and he talked to them. And he offered one of them, the leader or whatever, like in charge of the group, a man, Polish man, he offered them money, or maybe not money, because I think that the Germans had changed the money or something. They made it like ghetto money. So if you had the older money, you couldn't use it. But anyway, he offered them something of value, and so that we could join them when they return across the wall. And as luck has it, God's help, we were able to cross the wall. The guards at the gate, the wall had guard posts every couple of blocks. There was an opening, and there was a guard, like a little booth, and he stood there, you know, and he was watching. If you went there, he would ask you papers or something. So I guess this group had a paper with their names on it, and somehow this woman who was in the group, she added some names. So the guard that looked, she says, you know, go, whatever. She just waved us off, and we went across. And then we ended up on the Aryan side of Warsaw, out of the ghetto. And so we were safe. I mean, to some extent, we were still Jews, and we were in this group. And of course, we had to separate later, and eventually I ended up with a family of non-Jews. And, you know, there was a lot that went on afterwards. But then within a few days, the ghetto started burning because it was the uprising. So by then we were on the other side, and the people just kept looking, and the fires were burning in houses, and the Germans had brought in artillery, and they were like breaking down one house after another, destroying everything that was there, because there were some Jews who had smuggled a few weapons in there, including like bottles filled with gasoline, and they were like throwing them at the Germans with a wick, you know, they lit a wick and threw the bottle, and it like exploded with the gasoline. So the Germans brought in some artillery. I mean, they just put a big heavy gun in, and they would like aim at the house, and collapsed. After a few shells, the house collapsed. So if there were Jews in there, they would died. Or if they were in a basement, they had to crawl out from the basement to survive, and then the Germans could shoot them or arrest them or whatever, you know, send them off.
Yeah, I don't want to go into this now,
Yeah.
but did you ever go to a camp, or were you?
I was what are called today hidden children. In other words, I survived the war among a family of non-Jews. They kept me.
So next time I want to hear all about that.
Right. Well, that's how I survived.
Yeah, we're getting close to
Right.
So I just thought of a couple more questions for you. But before the ghettos, and things were normal.
That was before the war started, right? Or before?
Yeah. Well, when you were a young child,
kid,
do you remember do you remember having any favorite foods or any snacks that you would enjoy eating?
I remember one thing that we loved in the winter was ice cream, but in Polish it's called lody, which is like ice cream, and it was a very popular food, and all the kids loved it. But you know, in Poland, in these European countries, where it's cold, and they don't eat ice cream in the winter. It's just in the summertime. So whenever we went out, I always would ask my mother for ice cream, you know, and we would go and she'd buy me an ice cream cone or something. It was a little more primitive the way it is here, but it was still, and it was sweet, and I loved it.
What flavor?
I think, I don't remember. I think there weren't so many flavors. It was mostly vanilla, I think, and it was somewhat different taste than here, because they didn't have the technology maybe for keeping it, you know, so cold and all that. Most of it was kept in ice.
But you ate that in the winter?
No, it was summertime.
Oh.
Summertime. Only summer. They did not sell ice cream in the winter. First of all, people in Europe in those days thought that ice cream eating would cause you to catch a cold or something. In other words, it was they were worried about, you know, how can you eat ice cream? So they didn't sell it in the winter, but they sold it in the summer. They had chocolate. There was some chocolate that you could buy, and candy. Well, you know, that was my favorite things.
Yeah. Did you have any pets?
No, we never did. You know, my parents loved dogs, but somehow Jewish people, even today, you know, among the religious people, they don't have so many pets. I mean, you know, like, I guess we had dogs were around, but we never took care of them. They were just there. They lived in the street, and they used to come into the house. Sometimes my mother would feed them, but we never owned them.
Yeah. Did you ever name them?
No. And the cats, there were plenty of cats too. But that's because they were just living on the street.
Was there anything you wanted to be when you grew up? I guess job?
Right. I never really, when I was 5 it was too early, but during the wartime, my biggest ambition was to survive the war, basically, and just hope that I can live long enough to get through this. It was like we never really thought we would. I mean, most of the time we just figured day by day, you know. I was with a group of non-Jews, so they were nice to me, but they had their own children, and so I was like somebody neglected.
How did feeling that way, that you might not make it to the next day, affect how you thought about life and lived each day?
You know, I guess it takes time for a person to adjust to that you see so many dead people, like when in the Warsaw, in the ghetto, for example, that your life is like day to day, you know. You never really think, if you survived a day, then you were happy. You know, you never really thought of like what's going to happen in 5 years from now, because nobody ever thought they would live 5 years. It was basically like a day-to-day existence, and there was never any talk about what you're going to be. I could never imagine that I could be a person who could do whatever you want. You had to always hide, you know, and walk like bent over and not look at the German in the face, but then don't turn away because then he'll get suspicious. So just walk straight, but don't look at them, you know. It was always some kind of a warning about something. So it was just a very hopeless feeling people had, you know. And imagine, the older you were, the more you realized what's going on. And if you had children, my God, you know, how can I save my children from this, you know? And it was hard. I guess children weren't so badly in such a bad state because the older people felt it more than the kids, you know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but we're about to run out
Yeah,
of tape.
right.
Well, I think that's.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you came, and I
Thank you.
enjoyed telling you some of this stuff, and I'm happy that you want to know, because many of the people of my generation, of course, the older ones, there aren't so many, you know, really. Who survivors are rare and in between.
Yeah.
It's hard to find, and so I do my best.
Yeah, thank you so much
keep
for
it.
sharing everything you
All right,
did.
it was a pleasure, Samantha. Very nice. And I'll see you next time. My wife actually